warm welcome to World Talks. I'm Sally Jastrzębska. Today we're joined by journalist and author Tom Mutch, whose book The Dogs of Mariupol gives a powerful first-hand look at the war in Ukraine, especially the devastating impact on the people of Mariupol. It's a raw and moving account that shows the horrors of war, but also the strength of those living through it. Hello and welcome, Tom. Delighted to have you with us. So,
thank you so very much for having me and giving me a chance to talk about the book and what's been going on in Ukraine for the last 3.5 years.
So let's start with the title, right? The Dogs of Mariupol. I mean, what does it mean and sort of why did you choose this particular title?
So I was in Mariupol, which, as your viewers probably know, is the city that was the most heavily damaged and destroyed by the Russian attack. And I was there just before the full-scale invasion started. And we went around talking to a lot of people and asking them, and no one was really prepared for a war. They kept on saying things like, oh, well, you know, there's been a war going on nearby. It won't be anything serious. We think politicians are just talking their heads off. But then, for some odd reason, the dogs in the city just would not stop barking over and over again. And I started to get kind of creeped out by it and thinking, wow, what's going on here? And it turned out, obviously, that maybe the dogs knew something that was coming that we didn't. And that image, you know, whether it's superstitious or true, it stayed with me. And I thought, well, that is a really interesting thing to call a book. And that's why I called the book The Dogs of Mariupol, just because that memory stayed with me the whole time.
Absolutely, it is highly symbolic. And you combine frontline war coverage, right, with these deeply human stories. So how did you find and develop trust with the civilians and soldiers that you write about?
So one of the best things about doing a book, especially a book that's about 3 years worth of reporting, is that you can spend a long time with people and you can gain their trust. So for instance, with soldiers, they're a lot more likely to trust you if you've seen and you've gone to their frontline positions and you've met them 2 or 3 times, because they're like, okay, this guy is not just coming in for one story. He wants to actually know our stories over the whole length of time. And so, for instance, there's one young woman who I based a large chapter on. I had met her very, very shortly before the start of the war, just at sort of a journalist meetup in a cafe. And then I ended up meeting her a 1.5 years later in Bakhmut, where she was now a press officer in an artillery battalion. And then she met her fiance there. I will take the liberty of showing you their photos. She met her fiance there. He was killed, unfortunately, in the Kursk operation when Ukraine went into there. These are the 2 of them. I want to show you their photos at the bottom there. And she then decided that rather than sort of just going to his funeral and mourning, she would actually do the same job as him. So she decided to get training to be a frontline drone pilot. And she's now gone out and joined the Ukrainian brigade to do exactly that. So yeah, it's really being able to spend as much time as possible with people and getting them to trust your stories over a longer period of time than just meeting them once.
So she's continuing his mission. That is very impressive. And you introduced this idea of Ukraine's Iron Generation. So what defines this new generation and sort of why did you choose that phrase?
So I thought the title came originally from something that European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said, calling the people who were dying on Ukraine's battlefields a golden generation. But I thought that wasn't quite the right phrase, because gold is it's a metal that's very kind of malleable. It's not very useful other than just for how pretty it looks. I liked iron because, iron needs to be forged under really sort of harsh, strong conditions. And it's also a really strong metal that you make weapons and shells and everything out of. So I thought, that's a much better title for talking about all of these young people in Ukraine who have now become part of this really strong, tough generation that's had to fight the Russian invasion.
And sort of what psychological toll did you observe when you were there on the ground, I mean, on these people? And how do you think this will affect Ukraine's rebuilding for the years to come? Because there are also these people who left, right? And they presumably will come back.
Yes. Now, this is a very, very difficult topic to sometimes talk about because there's a lot of internal problems in Ukraine. Look, we all know, and you probably know in Poland, I was on the radio with a journalist in Spain a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking about how sometimes in the streets in Marbella, where he was, and I'm sure it's the same in Warsaw or in Krakow, you will see young Ukrainian men with, like, you know, flash cars or buying tables at clubs and things like that, often flaunting very obvious wealth. And you're like, hang on, what's going on here? Isn't there supposed to be a war going on in your country? And I understand that very well, and so do people who are still in Ukraine, because there is this really big sort of tension, societal issue between those who are fighting there on the front lines, you know, who've, you know, suffered unimaginable horrors, and those who have left and haven't really seen a lot of the war up close. So I think when the war does finish, this conflict between the two groups, those who fought and those who left, is going to be really significant in society.
And, well, changing the topic a little bit, your account sort of also explores these key military questions, right? I mean, could Russia have taken Kyiv? Was Bakhmut a strategic error, for instance? So what did you uncover in your reporting about these turning points? What is your take on these questions?
So when we go back, let's talk about Kyiv, for instance, is one of the things that we realize is that actually the Russians were not that far off. They weren't that far off getting Kyiv and other major cities in the start. And that one of the reasons that their initial operation went so badly was because they thought it was legitimately going to be a special military operation. If anyone remembers Crimea, or if anyone, particularly in Central Europe, remembers Prague in 1968, the operation in Ukraine was really supposed to look like that, a sort of an overwhelming show of force that would just shock the Ukrainians into some kind of submission. Now, that didn't happen. However, the Russians got very, very close to Kyiv. They got very, very close to taking Chernihiv, which would have given them a really good logistics point to assault Kyiv from another direction. You know, if Zelensky had left in those first few days, if there hadn't been, you know, like a good drone team that was able to scout the Russian approaches from the east, if the Ukrainians hadn't happened to have had one really good artillery brigade in Kyiv that could stop the Russians in their tracks, the Ukrainians would have been in much more serious trouble if the Ukrainians hadn't decided to disperse their forces away from their main barracks in literally the first, you know, hours before the initial assault started. It could have gone really badly. And so part of the research has been looking at, you know, just actually how close Ukraine did come to losing in those first few days. And when we went on, one of the things that when I talk about when I talk about Bakhmut is it's the clash between political goals and military goals, right? So Zelensky wanted to hold on to Bakhmut because he saw it as kind of a symbol of Ukrainian unity and resistance and strength. That's why he took that flag to the US Congress. And it was brilliant as that symbol. However, by the time that went on, Bakhmut was no longer a good place to hold on to because, you know, all the logistics supplies were severed. The Russians had like the high ground that they could bombard Ukraine from around the city. And so that was an example of when Zelensky's, you know, very reasonable political goals really clashed with Ukraine.
So the cost was very high, right?
Militarily.
And sort of looking back now, I mean, how do you evaluate Ukraine's long-term strategy in the war based on your interviews and observations?
So I think Ukraine has generally done a pretty good job, and probably better than, almost anyone could have predicted based on what they're fighting against. Remember, they're fighting against a country that has about 5 times the population, that has about 2.5 times the GDP per capita, and they have managed to, they've been counted out again and again and again and again, and they've found ways to adapt, they've found ways to find new partners who are willing to bring in, aid and ammunition. They've found so many different ways to, make it so that they have enough, soldiers, artillery ammunition. When that ran out, they started making drones, and they have just done so many things. And I don't want to say it's just Ukraine's military as well, because it's been an entire kind of population effort. Loads of the civilians are doing things like building drones in their basements or fundraising to buy artillery ammunition or, drone parts for soldiers at the front line and things like that. So I think they've done very, very well when you consider what they're up against.
So our viewers may not know that you're a reporter banned from Russia, yet you nonetheless entered front lines in places like Kursk. So can you tell us a little bit more about some of the risks that you face and why you chose to continue?
Of course. Look, I want to make clear that for almost all journalists, the risks we take are a lot lower than the risks that the soldiers who are there almost every single day take. So I was on a list of sort of Russophobes. About once a year, the Russian foreign ministry or the embassy in a lot of different countries, they will put out a list of people who are banned from Russia for their Russophobic views. It includes things like, the defense minister and the head of the people that were training, soldiers for New Zealand soldiers who are training Ukrainian soldiers in the UK, and journalists who've reported critically on what Russia has been doing in Ukraine. And I turned up on that list, which means I'm supposedly banned from ever entering Russia again. Well, about 6 weeks later, the Ukrainians launched the Kursk operation. They took a large part of the Kursk Oblast in Russia, and I managed to get invited along with the Ukrainian unit with a very small group of journalists to go and see actually a Ukrainian operation being taken place in Kursk, which was, I was just quite pleased that, after being banned from Russia forever, I had managed to overturn that ban effectively within 6 weeks. But once again, I wanted to remind your viewers that while, we do take these risks, we're going into these battle zones for maybe, 4 to 6 hours at a time. There are people who are there for 4 to 6 weeks at a time on the zero line with no rest or respite. They're the ones that really should be getting, the praise for their bravery, not people like me who, do it for a day every couple of months.
And Tom, just to round up our talk, and I'll ask you for a very brief answer, what do you hope readers take away from your book?
I really want people to take away just how much all of society in Ukraine has been affected by this, and how the Ukrainian nation really has been kind of transformed and turned upside down by what really has been an existential war that no one's seen really in the world since 1945.
Tom Mutch, the author of The Dogs of Mariupol, thank you so much for being with us this morning. Much appreciated. And thank you for watching World Talks.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Please stay tuned for more here on TP World.